Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views respectfully stated are welcomed here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Matthew Reyna, and I'm the director here with ONC. Director of Media here with ONC. I'm joined here by Tanya Ruiz-Ortiz, who is our Infrastructure and Development Team Lead with ONC, as well as Abhinav Banerjee and Rohan Krishnamurthy, who are both interns here with ONC on the Foreign Policy and Defense team. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for being here. So this is our first podcast with Foreign Policy and Defense, and I thought it would be good to start off with basically the biggest events that is underway in the foreign policy and defense realm, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about that, giving a little bit of a summation of where we're at now. Current analysis is just showing that this conflict has been ongoing for about 9 months now, right? Where we stand today is essentially at the end of a recent Ukrainian offensive that resulted in quite significant gains, reclaiming territory that they had lost in the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine. In response, Russia has mobilized about 300,000 soldiers. We have seen that I think at the moment they've probably got maybe about 250,000 mobilized at the moment. But that did not come without some costs. Russia has endured significant civil unrest across Russia, particularly on the municipalities furthest away from Moscow. And at the moment, a new recent escalation came when we don't know exactly who has done it yet, but somebody has blown up the Kerch Bridge that goes across the U.S. Strait. Just for context, that is the bridge that connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. And it was a structure that was pretty heavily promoted and touted by the Russian regime as a successful operation, particularly as a result of the 2014 Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea. If anybody would like to pick it off there, please do so.
Currently, I think that's a good idea of what the status on the ground is. But I think that it's also worth noting that in response to what is likely a Ukrainian attack, almost certainly, the Russians have responded with a wave of what we can only describe as terror bombing against Ukrainian cities and civilian populations, using drones provided by Iran to strike the Ukrainian population and try and overwhelm and attrit Ukrainian air defenses that have been active, and not only just active, but very effective since the invasion began. It's also worth noting that Ukraine currently has been finding mass graves throughout Ukraine, everywhere from just on the outskirts of Kiev to newly liberated cities in the Donbass and in Kharkiv oblasts. The fact is that Ukraine is facing a potential, they're facing a war in which Russia is seeking maximalist aims, which is a repudiation of Ukrainian statehood and nationhood, and a repudiation of Ukrainian right to exist, in a sense. So it's not surprising that the Ukrainians are fighting back with everything they have. It's also not surprising that many countries see this as a cause worthy of support, and have offered aid to Ukraine in opposition to Russia. I also think it's important to realize that Russia has on paper at least, annexed part of Ukraine. Not including the obvious annexation of the Crimea. They've also annexed or claimed to have annexed Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk and Luhansk. And despite the fact that no one else has recognized these annexations as being anything other than on paper and in the minds of Russian leadership and their media. It's also worth noting that neither side has much of an incentive to put down their arms at the moment. Ukraine is winning on the ground, and Russia doesn't want to look weak, so they're not going to put down their arms. So, and this conflict obviously has massive geopolitical and geographic, not geographic, geopolitical and foreign policy related and humanitarian related consequences, which I think we're going to get into in this podcast a little bit more.
Of course, when talking about this, it's not necessarily that Russia or that the conflict has caused some of the global instability that we're encountering. A good part of it also is just because of the after effects of the pandemic. The monetary and fiscal policies that many countries took. Can't necessarily blame them for it, but yeah, the conflict has certainly exacerbated a lot of the problems that we were already dealing with in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I also found it interesting too, Rohan, that you had mentioned the political conflict here when it comes to international support or recognition of Russian actions of the Ukrainian cause here. It's also interesting too to note that Russia is playing its own game. It seems that even though they've of course started this conflict unilaterally, they haven't received outright support from any country. Even their you could say their principal ally here, China, has been tacitly supporting them. Same thing with India, but India, you can't really classify that as support. It's just more of India's pursuing its own regional strategic goals, basically looking out for its own interests, which can't necessarily blame them for. Both China and Russia are purchasing energy, oil from Russia. Last I checked, while the average oil price right now, I think is about $89, maybe $95 a barrel, I think. China and India are receiving their energy from Russia at a heavily discounted price, which last I checked again was about $30 a barrel for oil, which is a massive discount. So I think this brings us to, probably the next point. One of the most recent developments in the conflict goes back to how, and I believe Rohan, you brought this up here, was how Ukraine or how Russia now is sourcing, you can call it quote unquote suicide drones that are designed strictly to, they're strictly in the sense of nearly a missile where you just launch it and it lands somewhere, usually in civilian infrastructure, military infrastructure. You can say that, critical infrastructure such as electricity affects both military and civilian casualty or civilian infrastructure. So what can you guys tell us about this? Who are they targeting? Who are they affecting? Tanya, since you're infrastructure team lead, I think you might have a little bit to discuss there.
Yes, so what I'm going to do is illustrate the infrastructural damages to Ukraine. And listeners out there might question, why should I care about these damages? Well, it's important to know the infrastructural damage to Ukraine during the war to illustrate their current capacities as a country. So infrastructural damages is a consequence of war, right? That affects people's livelihoods, moral standing, health, and education. So I have these little breakdown into the major sectors of infrastructure to Ukraine, but just a fair reminder, these are numbers that were updated as of September 5th, 2022, with the current attacks on Ukraine as of October 2022. These numbers are expected to rise, but these should be enough to illustrate the current situation. So I'm going to begin looking at Ukrainian agriculture, right? So Ukraine is the biggest producer of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil. It's typically called this bread queen, something like that. And the Ministry of Agriculture now says that 30% of the country's farmland is occupied or unsafe. Now, what does that mean? That means they are not able to produce their wheat, corn, and sunflower oil at the level they used to before the conflict really rose in 2022 because this conflict has been going on since, I believe, 2014, but has truly been exemplified now. So this has led to about $4.3 billion worth of damage, and I'm rounding this to US dollars for perspective. So that's a lot. But what impact does that have not only on Ukraine, its neighbor countries, and the US? Well, rising cost of food, which also leads to food shortages, right? So the American impact will be an increase in prices on wheat-based products. So even if we do not directly import from Ukraine, the surrounding countries do. And when they're receiving less stock, it causes them to increase the price because there's less quality, but increased demand, right? So this leads to a lack of agriculture, leads to people being fearful, causing fear in the United States. We see those empty grocery shelves and we think panic. We automatically panic about what's happening, but we can correlate this to the damage that's being done to Ukrainian agriculture, at least one aspect. And when when Ukraine has a limited amount of land, it leads to overworking the land. So that leads to a decrease in land capacity, which is bad because winter is coming, right? Ukrainian winter is coming, which leads to a mass migration of Ukrainian people in Ukraine to different parts of their neighboring countries. So you're going to see increased migration, which is going to put a lot of tension on the ground because there's more civilians walking around, right? Then we have Ukrainian energy. So what is it? What's the damage being done to it? So there's about an estimated 1.8 billion in damages. But again, the recent attacks on Ukrainian electric power and heating plants, the number is expected to rise. But aside from the impacts from Ukraine, which they're expecting heat shortages, Zelensky has asked people to have more of those like fire pits, like more unconventional ways to heat, especially during the winter is coming. But the impact of this, that it's very clear that Russian strategy is to, like, quote unquote, destroy Ukrainian energy infrastructure because they're really dependent on this. With no heat, you're gonna see a decrease in morale, right? Because they're thinking it's a cold and hard winter. Why should we do this? So we're gonna see a decrease in Ukrainian not morals. So but President Zelensky has called for the West for more air defenses to protect their power stations and dams, and President Biden has agreed. So we're going to see more U.S. Aggression towards Russia, and also, I believe, Russian response into that aggression towards the United States. So that's our impact. We're going to see the U.S. become more active in delaying this conflict, or I would even say feeding into the conflict. So that impact on Americans is, I guess, this idea of nuclear proliferation, right? Which we're going to get into. The debate of will this nuclear war happen and how would this affect Americans? But I believe we'll get into that later. In terms of Ukrainian transport, there's about $35.1 billion worth of damage. So about 300 bridges on major highways were damaged or destroyed, 8,000 kilometers of roads damaged. This means it's harder to transport goods across the border. This means their trade is affected. So when trade is affected, they're going to have less money to buy weapons or supply food for their own people. And the impact on this is that transportation is thus disrupted against their neighboring countries. So this has led to EU sanctions on Russia, including aircrafts and vessels, but it also has resulted in US supply chain problems. This can be linked to certain freight obstructions, but I believe that has been dialing back. But in the long term, this means Ukraine is going to need more in-person support in order to boost up their own sectors, so they're not solely dependent on aid from foreign countries like the US. In terms of Ukraine housing, we're seeing about $47.8 billion worth of damage. Again, this is expected to rise with the current attacks. But most of this damage was done to apartment buildings and homes. Obviously, that results in people being left without homes and having to leave, right? So this has led to about a displacement of like 8 million people,
with 6.5 million moving to neighboring countries. This really disrupts the moral standing of Ukrainians, but also the livelihoods of individual people. But the Kyiv School of Economics estimated over 100,000 private homes have been damaged or destroyed. Ukraine ministry has set out a program to fund these people's homes in order to rebuild them, but that's still in the talks. It hasn't been really established yet. I believe they're expecting foreign support in order to fund this program to bring Ukrainians back home. But the impact of this is we see a rise of refugees, right? And rise of refugees means more camps. And these camps are either going to be at overcapacity and struggling due to energy like shutoffs. The Ukrainian PM says rebuilding should cost about, I believe, 750 billion. So Ukrainian officials are urging people to conserve energy right now, prepare for the winter ahead. With the aggressive attacks happening of late, there seems to be an ever-growing urgency to end the war or to have some reconciliation. But I believe we're going to get into that later in the podcast on what this could look like and what it should look like. But in all these setbacks, the Ukrainian infrastructure has leaked to its neighboring countries and also has and would even more leak into the lives of American people.
Yes, we've seen this strategy from the Russians, Vladimir Putin, in Syria. The goal is to destroy as much civilian infrastructure as they possibly can, if their goal is basically to take the territory, right? If you start destroying civilian infrastructure, the ability for average normal people to live in a certain area by destroying electricity supplies, by cutting off water supplies, by taking advantage of weather and how geography would affect whether or not a person will stay, and you force them to become refugees, at that point, that's when you'll know that whoever stays behind is more than likely a fighter. And Rohan, please go ahead.
Yeah, I do want to sort of push back a little bit on that concept. Historical studies have shown that terror bombing actually is a very ineffective way of making people lose morale. It hurts immediate vicinities, but over a large population center like Kyiv or Kharkiv or Odessa or Lviv, right, where a lot of these attacks are being targeted against, the fact is that a lot of these people, rather than being pushed towards peace, move towards continued aggression. That's sort of a natural response, right? You have been attacked. You survived, but now you're angry. So now you're going to say that we need to continue the fight. In fact, there's been some recent data that's come out. I don't exactly remember off the top of my head the exact numbers, but I believe that most Ukrainians are actually more and more convinced that they need to support a military conclusion to this conflict, if for no other reason than just to stop these missile attacks, because that's their position now. Because they've been attacked, the Russians have been attacking civilian infrastructure and civilian buildings. They're not attacking the military, and when they do attack the military, they tend to fail. So from their perspective, this is clearly just this is, I mean, we've seen pictures from the very beginning of the war when they had all the advantages on their side, just missing military targets and hitting civilian targets, and now they're just hitting civilian targets because they're angry, and the Russians are angry, right? And the Ukrainians are understandably a little bit ticked about that and aren't exactly going to be more conducive to a peace.
Yeah, so I guess my assumption of morale has to do with the fact that like winter is coming, they're going to see more struggles ahead, because while this conflict has been going on since 2014, it hasn't been at this level. So morale is high, yes, because it's very, nationalist thing, they want to protect their own country, but I don't see this being something that is like morale growing as these tensions continued,
Right.
because like they're gonna see more struggle. Yes, they're used to their winter, but not winter during a war, right? So while it's good that the Ukrainian people are motivated, I'm not sure this is gonna be enough, and I'm not even sure U.S. support is gonna be enough for this war to continue. As we're seeing with these damages, we're seeing how people are displaced. It just makes sense that this war should end soon, but it comes down to the question of how and what's the impacts of that decision of negotiations going to happen.
While it has definitely hurt Ukraine, just the damage, the infrastructure damage has effects on the global economy as well. Just going off of the fertilizer, which is the fertilizer that was produced in Ukraine that have been destroyed, but also the sanctions that have been put onto Russia and Belarus. I think there's sanctions on Belarus. There is, right? Yeah. So,
Yes.
Both Russia and Belarus, contribute about 40% of the world's potash, which is a fertilizer. Now that we've cut them off from the market, while there's American and I believe European companies that are able to produce fertilizer, it's not enough, and it wasn't enough, to ensure that a safe and full planting season would have been had. So then in 2022, later this year, and most likely into next year, we're going to be running into major food crises as well. In addition to an issue when it comes to global shipping, right? We've seen already that it's been incredibly difficult to get food products out of Ukraine, who is, like Tanya mentioned, was one of the world's largest producers for wheat, if I remember correctly, right? So that has had global ramifications. And then Rohan, what would you like to say?
Yeah, so two things. One, the first thing was in response to Tanya. So winter is coming. That much we all know, as is often quoted by all parties.
George R.R. Martin, he said it first. Yeah.
He said it first. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in this case, there have been some interesting meteorological reports from Europe that suggest that it's actually going to be a very mild winter. It isn't going to be the sort of the freezing winters of like the mid 1940s where armies froze to death on the march. In truth, this is probably going to be a pretty mild winter, and that's sort of the silver lining in it's winter is coming for Ukraine, right? Because the good news for Ukraine is that even if Russia mobilizes its forces, even if Russia brings in its forces, Russia can't really do anything with those forces until after the mud comes in and makes things very difficult to move. Unless, of course, you have somewhat professional military that knows how to do those things, which Russia kind of lost. And what is left of it is stuck in possibly the most pointless battle of the war down in Kherson, where they are being cut to bits by the Ukrainians, who are slowly just pounding them away with artillery and infantry and tanks, right? And airstrikes, right? They're just moving slowly forward. And sort of the second thing is the food is actually a huge issue, because Ukraine's food exports aren't mostly to Europe. Most of Europe grows its own food. The big issue is that it feeds a lot of people in sub-Saharan Africa.
And the developing world, right?
In the developing world in particular. They are going to be, they're the most food vulnerable people on the planet, right? So they are in need of food, and Russian actions have made that difficult. And as you said, airstrikes in particular, and particularly the most recent wave of airstrikes, makes things really difficult for Ukraine, because they only have one functional port at the moment, which is the port of Odessa. So if you want to ship grain, the safest, easiest, and quickest way to move grain is by sea in volume. But you can't put them on trains, you can't put them on trucks. They won't have. There's simply not enough rail stock or trucks available in all of Europe. Even if all of Europe came together, they couldn't do it. Because shipping containers is how we move stuff like that. So I think you guys both brought up good points on that, but I also think that we need to talk about what the US can do to sort of curb these influences. And I think the number one thing that the US can do is send some stuff for air defense. Of course, Ukraine has their own indigenous manpad systems, and they use those. They also have the S-300 system, which is a Soviet era system that works very well. Lots of countries use it, including several NATO states, because it is a very effective air defense system. But the fact is, and Ukrainian leadership has mentioned this multiple times, is that they're running out of missiles. They can't use these systems anymore, and they need a replacement. So part of the replacement is, well, two countries have sort of stepped forward to, well, three countries technically, have stepped forward to offer replacement to this. So Norway and America have brought the NASAM system, which is currently being trained on by Ukrainian armed forces, I believe in Poland or Germany right now, just so that they can get experience. That started about 2 weeks ago. So hopefully by the end of the week or maybe next week, they will get these systems installed, but they only have 2 of them so far. And they're very rare. The US doesn't really even use them except for protection of high value targets. The DC and a couple of other cities like that at home. And the other one is the Germans, who sent the IRIS-T system, which is their version of that, but it uses their own missiles and their own system for targeting. Good news, bad news, these are good systems. Bad news is that there really aren't as many. Germany has given them 4. I believe they only have 6 total. So
right, and that all brings us to, so it's not, sorry to cut you off, Rohan, but yeah, no, that brings us to some recent developments, right? Of course, there's a few things that we can talk about going right off of what you were mentioning is U.S. stockpiles of many of these weapons here, and our inability to replenish them as quickly as we would like, and God forbid, in if we were to have a conflict with China, while this or conflict with anyone and any near peer power, while this conflict with Ukraine and Russia is ongoing, and if we're still providing ammunition to them, especially for some of these higher tech technologies, right, or the higher tech weaponry, and we don't have the ability to replace them yet. Our industrial base isn't at that capacity level yet. Also, too, just to mention, I think you alluded to this briefly, Rohan, is that especially what these last missile attacks against Kiev and more interior targets has provoked is now a real partnership amongst the United States, many European countries, particularly Germany. I believe this is a German-led project. It also involves Israel to an extent, at least their ability to interlink with it is a continental missile defense system that they're pretty much talking about. From what I understand, it's about at least 15 countries, mainly in the NATO military alliance, including the UK and Netherlands, have signed a letter of intent to join a long-term German project to create a European anti-missile shield that would boost protection for much of the continent. Not sure if that would include Ukraine, but I know that this is at least including most of the probably Western Central European continent here. I imagine that Eastern Europe would also jump in soon. How that would affect our relations with Russia, that's to be foreseen. Rohan, go ahead, and then afterwards.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to add one thing. So Eastern Europe has actually heavily invested in anti-missile systems. For example, I believe Romania and Poland have both signed partnerships with the US to invest in sort of the US's frontline anti-missile defense system, which is Aegis Shore, which is basically, we take the Aegis system that is on our destroyers and cruisers and carriers, and we put that on a shore-based battery, and theoretically it can shoot down even it can shoot down IRBMs, and it can shoot down, which are sort of the shorter range version of ICBMs. And
right. Can you define for our listeners? Can you define
sure
RIBMs, ICBMs, please?
So it's basically a question of range. ICBMs are, as the name suggests, are intercontinental. They're designed to shoot, basically, for instance, for the US, it's designed to shoot from North Dakota or South Dakota over the North Pole and hit a target in Russia or in China or wherever we want them to hit. For Russia, likewise, it's designed to be fired from Siberia and launch over the North Pole and hit targets in the US, France, the UK, China and other locations, right? IRBMs are shorter range. They don't take as they aren't these big rockets. They're smaller. They're more compact. They can be moved around more discreetly, but they don't carry as many warheads. They can't deliver as much thermonuclear firepower as ICBMs can. But the advantage is that they are smaller and faster, and you can move them around more easily and reposition them when you want them to be repositioned. And IRBMs are most known for, if people remember of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I knew
the
you were going to say
problem
the Cuban
was,
Missile Crisis, right?
yeah, those were the missiles. They weren't the ICBMs. So yeah, so the US is already working on that. I believe the German plan is to interconnect with that US system.
Yes.
So the good news is, because these far eastern European sort of systems, right, in Poland and in Romania, are supposed to, on paper, what we told the Russians when we did the thing, when the three countries basically signed the agreement to go with this system, was that, oh no, this is not designed to go after Russia. This is designed to prevent Iran from launching missiles at Europe, which we all can fairly agree on is a bald-faced lie.
Right, but especially now, yes, especially
yeah.
now,
Right.
you know, given the utility, we're showing exactly what those things are capable of in terms of how we would.
We haven't actually, because we haven't sent those systems. But yeah, that's basically what's going on there. I think Tanya's has her hand up for a while. So
yeah, go ahead, please, Tanya. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we've illustrated the conflict, right? We illustrated the impacts of this, but there is still the debate of, should the United States continue to support Ukraine with military and humanitarian aid? I think that is an important thing we should discuss, because Americans listening might be saying, okay, but so what? Should the US still be the one offering the most aid to Ukraine? And we ought to discuss the conservative perspective against with the Ukrainian issue as well, just to really show our American viewers that, like, you know, we value their perspective as well, and that this is something we ought to discuss.
Let's be honest here that, you know, of course, Ukraine is suffering greatly in this, and that they are bearing the brunt of the costs here when it comes to the United States, the international community. You know, we're providing weaponry and funds for, you know, continuity of government and things like that. But you know, this is both a local, regional issue, but it also has global ramifications as well. I think we all agree on that. We see the energy crisis, the food crisis. You know, it's become a very heated political topic in multiple continents. So Abhinav, please address some of that.
Yes, so I just wanted to discuss the costs of the conflict, more so like to what extent would the United States want to finance the war that is going on, not finance, but like help Ukraine defend itself against its obvious adversary, Russia, that is increasingly being volatile against it and is defying its territorial integrity. This kind of brings, Rohan was mentioning the use of the kamikaze drones and how they would how they're more likely to rile up potential conflict even more, and people would like to fight against Russia even more, and it will exacerbate the conflict to a multitude of higher degrees. Which really brings, like, is there even like an end to the conflict? And the recent global developments kind of suggest that there are potential other conflicts also. Xi Jinping just gave a speech saying that, you know, we kind of want to take Taiwan sooner, like much sooner than we eventually planned. So where would the United States be going in that direction? Would it be able to finance the war in those two directions if certain things happen simultaneously? More so, I'm pretty sure the Republican side of the United States right now is quite concerned about the cost of the war and them financing more weapons and sending aid. And I see that Rohan would like to point out a few things, so I think Rohan can do it.
Oh, no, I'm sorry if I cut you off. Please keep going. It's actually quite interesting. But I do want to say that there's actually been a sort of conflicting. This is an ongoing debate within the Republican Party at the moment. So today there were two big pieces of news from the Republican side, of this viewpoint. One was Representative Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, saying that if the Republicans win the House in 2022 in the general elections, so the midterm elections, the Republicans will scale down aid to Ukraine. I believe that's what he said. I don't have the exact quote memorized, unfortunately. But the other part was actually quite interesting. So Senator Jim Inhofe, who's one of the most conservative Republicans in the Senate, who's a member of the, I believe, Senate Armed Services, or no, I'm forgetting which committee he's a chairman of, but he and his committee's co-chairman in the Senate just put out a new bill, added a new part to the National Defense Authorization Act, which is actually something I've been writing on for ONC, where they've added additional equipment to the list that the military has already provided them with, like, oh, we want to get all these things. This is what we think this is going to be. So they've added extra funding for those programs. They've reduced some bureaucracy that was going to slow that down. And they've said, go get these items in addition to what you're already getting. We'll appropriate the money for it. That isn't an issue, right? And this has been passed with bipartisan support from both Republicans and Democrats. It's actually quite interesting because a lot of the equipment they want is actually equipment that has been either lend-leased and has been shown to be effective, or is going to be sort of potentially lend-leased. So, for example, one of the items that they want is ATACMs, which are sort of these theater ballistic missiles that are being used that the Ukrainians have wanted since June, and we haven't given it to them. That might change, but I think we've added a few hundred, maybe a few thousand of them to the stockpile that, according to this bill, right? It's going to go to conference committee anyway, so we might see a few things get changed around. But it's quite interesting to see that this is a bipartisan effort from both conservative Republicans and moderate and left-wing Democrats on this issue, right?
I had read that news this morning as well, and I'm interested in hearing more, like what's the reasoning behind it. What they've given so far is a thought that's been cropping up here and there in different political circles, whether it's Democrat or Republican, is okay, well, how long is this going to go on for, right? How much more money is the United States going to have to spend here? Is Ukraine critical to U.S. national security? A lot of these problems now that it's not so that these problems have, or these notions, these questions have arisen because it seems as though the conflict will likely drag on for quite a while, right? Russia shows no inkling to back down. Ukraine, of course, that now that coming off of their recent territorial gains or regains, I guess you could say, they're showing no inclination to back down. And at the same time, it appears that Vladimir Putin is being pushed further and further into a corner. And we see what happens with dictators domestically when they're pushed into a corner. They need to do something to gain to gain domestic support.
I think an important question here is also, is Ukraine worth fighting a nuclear war about?
Yes, it's that for many Americans.
I think that is the most critical question, because the risk of nuclear war is there. It's not super high, but any possibility of a nuclear conflict has to be taken with a degree of severity and seriousness. So would the United States consider going for a nuclear option in case Russia decides to, we are losing the war, we don't want to go down like this, we'll just kamikaze nuke Ukraine, potentially the other European allies? How would that go? Like, I think that would be a critical failure in that situation, although the situation has like a 0.1 chance of happening, but the possibility is still there and it cannot be negated. So
Right.
that is a potential question that the Americans might be fearing as well, because I've been watching the news, and I think one of the key things that a lot of news broadcasters are talking about is nuclear war. And I think it's sort of a jingoistic chant that's going on, like, oh, there's going to be a nuclear war, and like, what are we even going to do? Like, I don't think that Ukraine is worth fighting for in such a situation. So I think American public would be interested in such a situation, and they would want to negate it at any cost, especially since they are continents away and they have nothing to do with it.
Right. Tanya, what were you going to bring up?
Well, I believe he brings up a really excellent point about this idea of nuclear talks, right? A lot of news media, well, a lot of right-leaning news media is spouting this idea of, will Russia utilize their nuclear weapons? But then we have this idea of like mutually assured destruction. If they do this, they will lose a lot. They're losing more than just Ukraine, because how can you regain Ukraine if you bomb them with a nuclear weapon? There's the land they want is gone. The power they could get from Ukraine is gone. So I don't believe that's something that is practical of Russia, but then Russia right now is acting like a mouse in the corner, right? It's fearful of losing its power. So again, the question of will they or will they not? I don't think they would. So I don't believe that's something that should like take up a lot of conversation. But nonetheless, it's still something that Americans worry about, right? But my own biased perspective with the Ukrainian and Russian war is that it's surrounding US's hypocrisy with democracy, right? We are the so-called defenders of democracy, yet we have our own democratic issues here in the United States. So I, in my own biased perspective, have issues with the United States continuing to aid Ukraine, but we have our own domestic issues. This is also a view reflected by conservatives who believe, we should be the money that US is sending to Ukraine should be spent here. But then I'm also divided by this idea of ¿por qué no los dos? Right? Like, why not both? We can both support Ukraine and also fix our own domestic issues. But nonetheless, I still have this hypocrisy issue, right? Granted, my examples I will give are completely different from the Ukrainian situation. Like, my whole idea with Palestine is completely different with Ukraine, right? They're not the same. I can't really compare them, but still, I ask myself, why do we support Ukraine, but we don't support Palestine? Maybe it's our relationship with Israel. We want to conserve it. Maybe we don't want to be pushing these things back. Okay, I get it. But then we have this issue with like Muslims being persecuted, yet we don't support them if we're the so-called democracy holders. That's my own biases when it comes to that. But I still think that's something we have to address is, which I think Abhinav was getting into. It's like, what benefits does it provide for us in the long term? Yeah, our prices will go down if we end this conflict. But what else? Are we actually going to lose anything aside from this symbol of democracy? I would like to address that view of Americans might have.
If yeah, just going into that also, Tanya, I personally have those same views, in terms of, okay, well, it's being a millennial, growing up with Tupac, I'll always remember one quote that he had, or one quote that he said, we'll always have money for war, but not enough to feed the poor. While we have a lot of issues here in America, it does seem not counterproductive, but it does seem a little hypocritical espouse many of these idealistic views on democracy. While I think many of us here in our generation might say like ours is falling apart right now. While you can't necessarily conflate those two things, going off of what Rohan said, what McCarthy had said, from what I was able to gather quickly, was that he's painting a very plausible picture in the future, in that where the US is most likely going to go into a recession in these next few months, if we're not in one already. So the idea of, essentially bankrolling another country's conflict against Russia, who, quite honestly, too, if you believe that we're going to go into recession, you have to believe that Russia is going to go through something worse pretty soon. Looking at their national future, it's not bright, whether it's demographic issues, whether it's all the issues that come with an authoritarian regime. They who knows, they might not even last. We certainly will, but it's all about what shape afterwards. Rohan, go ahead.
Sorry, so I have a slightly different view from everyone else, it seems, on the podcast, which I think is good, right? I think that's part of the reason why we have this podcast.
It's exactly why we're here.
So I do agree with Tanya that we do need to discuss the issues with hypocrisies with regards to democracy. It's not just, as you brought up, Palestine or at home, but also places like Armenia or Taiwan that are democracies under threat from autocracies. And it's worth noting that Congress has actually been very supportive of funding those countries' defensive efforts, as well as their democratic efforts, their efforts to become more democratic, right? And I think that is something that's very, very interesting to see, because the executive branch isn't so into doing that, right? But at the same time, we kind of have to, right? It's about our credibility as a superpower, right? That's part of the idea, right? The whole game in international relations is this country being credible when it's making a threat or when it's taking certain actions, right? So if the US is unwilling to do this hurts our overall credibility. But at the same time, I agree, it is going to be an expensive endeavor. But that might actually be kind of useful to the US, where we can invest money into domestic industry, into domestic economic initiatives to to make ourselves more robust economically. So that's part of it. I also think, with regards to the nuclear question, I don't think Russia has the capacity to carry out a nuclear attack, in the sense that it isn't in their interests to do so. Because, and we can look at the Americans for this. I believe in the Gulf War, before going into the plan that we ended up doing, we're considering using tactical nuclear weapons. It's what most likely Russia would use in this case. In any case, those weapons don't really work in the way that they're sort of designed to work. But that's sort of the situation that's there. So I don't really think they're going to use the nuclear weapons. I think what is more likely is that they do something silly with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is totally different ballgame. And also, the US and NATO states have all pretty much said that they're ruling out the use of nuclear weapons in response to Russian nuclear weapon use in Ukraine. However, as Emmanuel Macron tweeted, we're not going to use nukes, but we are going to do other things that are going to hurt them more. And several US leaders have stated stuff like, oh, we'll just wipe out their Air Force, right? Just take away their ability to use their Air Force in Ukraine, and take away their Black Sea Fleet, which kind of makes the entire Russian point of the war moot, right? You can't carry out an offensive without air support. You cannot carry out you can't do the interdiction of trade without the Russian Navy, right? And if it's not there, then they're in trouble.
Right. There's much more. There are many more worse things, things that will be dragged out for quite a long time than a response to a nuclear weapon. I've read a few editorials that argue that same point, Rohan, that the response to a Russian use of their nuclear weapons in Ukraine would be worse than the bomb itself, from what I understand. So I wanted to bring us down to the final part of our podcast here, which is like we say here, we're a solutions focused organization, right? While we are young, we do think that we have many valuable things to say here, especially if this is the world that we are going to inherit. Let's just lay out the situation here. Like I mentioned, the conflict has been ongoing for 9 months. It's exacerbated a lot of the problems that COVID had started, whether it's economic growths that are stalling, a recession looming already, fuel shortages that you can see videos of the effects of it in Europe. Germany's entire economic model without cheap Russian energy is done. Their ability to manufacture is basically stalling right now, and that is their entire base. 50% of their people are tradesmen. The other 50% are services oriented. Without manufacturing, without cheap Russian energy, they're done. I think that it's nearly a foregone conclusion here. Additionally, we have a food crisis that is just rearing its ugly head, and it's it's not talked about in the media right now for some reason. These things are looming in the background. We have inflation raging across the world, across the developed world right now. The higher dollar costs is putting further pressure on developing nations, so that not only do you have to deal with an oncoming debt crisis, but they're going to have to deal with food shortages, food and fuel crises as well, if this conflict keeps going on. So from each one of you, everybody here, from your perspectives, what are your thoughts? What do you think can be done here? See, this is the tough part. We can all, this is something that I think our organization tackles quite well. While we understand the complexity of the issues, we have to put forward some solutions. And of course, the idea is that others will be able to contribute to that, to make the solutions stronger, to make them more manageable. When it comes to war, let's hold no illusions here. When it comes to war, there's oftentimes only one winner. There are very rarely any times where it's a win-win, where the peace makes everybody happy, where it looks beautiful, where it contributes to idealistic thoughts. It's difficult, it's complex, and it's, at the end of the day, it's ugly. So do not be fearful. What is everyone's solutions?
So I guess I'll go first. I think the first thing we should do is we should look at actually using Lend-Lease. So Lend-Lease was passed in May of this year. We haven't actually started using it at all. We haven't actually, all we've done is give stuff to Ukraine. I believe the president is using his drawdown authority because parts of the US military are no longer using equipment that we've been sending to Ukraine. For example, the Marines have given up a lot of their tube artillery and their tanks. So we've moved Marine tanks to Poland so Poland can move their tanks to, because Poland is buying American tanks, part of their thing. They're going to buy American tanks, they're going to buy Korean tanks going forward. So they're going to buy, so we've loaned them our Abrams so that they can use their T-72s and send those to Ukraine, so Ukraine can use their, Ukraine can backfill their own stockpiles of T-72s. That's part of it. The other part of it is stuff like HIMARS systems and the M777 gun. So we've just given those to Ukraine. I think one part of it is Lend-Lease, because Lend-Lease also allows us to send fuel, allows us to send generators, it allows us to send a lot of stuff that we don't really think of as military stuff to Ukraine, so that they can actually continue to persecute this this war in self-defense, right? So I think that we should open up that pipeline and provide them with more support. But again, that's going to only be one part of the entire solution. I think that ultimately, as you said, Matthew, there is going to be, at some point, they're going to have to talk, but I don't think either side wants to talk right now. So we should be respectful of Ukraine's decision to say that we don't want to talk with Russia unless Russia is willing to actually make a good faith effort to at the very least hear what we want out of this conflict, rather than agree to their dictates, which Ukraine has kind of done for the last 8 years leading up to this.
Good. Thank you, Rohan. Tanya.
So both countries are going to have to deal with their issues of pride, right? Pride and honor. They don't want to be humiliated. So I believe it's going to come down to a sort of like freezing conflict, which some have some territories, some don't, much like, like North and South Korea, the strict divide, you don't cross the line, stuff like that, even more so, more heightened, because if like Putin were to claim Ukraine, I don't see that as being realistic because Ukraine has, asserted victory over Russia in some certain extent. It's surprisingly, they've held their ground, and Russia is not going to stop anytime soon. And we don't want the scenario of a lengthy war, nor do we want the US and its allies to be putting boots on the ground. So it comes down to this idea of division of territory, right? So I'm not sure who will get what, but that seems like the most practical one, right? It's this sort of division of who gets what, but then again, that's a debate. Who gets what, right? Who gets the Donbass? That's a big debate. Who gets more of the ports? That's a big debate. But that seems to me the more realistic. I don't know how they will get there because as Renan states, like negotiations very like fraught right now. He offered before and like in like the chats that there was attempts for peace negotiations, but Russia has thwarted that, with their own actions. I'm not gonna say exactly what because I'm not sure if that's like proven. I'm not sure Rohan can tell you that's been proven about the poisoning that was apparently done to Ukrainian peace negotiators. I'm not sure if he wants to jump into that real
Yeah,
quick.
it's disputed, but both a Russian national who was sort of trying to facilitate that negotiation because he's a personal friend of Vladimir Zelensky, Roman Abramovich, who's been against the war since it started. The U.S. is not certain about that, so it is a question mark, but it is something that might poison that well going forward. To pardon the pun.
Yeah, so my possible solution is division of territory. That's my idea.
Obviously, there can be no real victor in this war. Russia cannot have all that it wants, and Ukraine, if it continues in this pace, Ukraine would have to make some concessions regarding a peace settlement. So freezing the war is the likely outcome. Don't know how that's going to happen. Both countries would have to do a cost benefit analysis on that and somehow reach a settlement. Might take months or even years to do that. But that is the only possible solution regarding food security. I think India is a potentially really good market if the United States is able to negotiate it really well, because right now they have kind of closed their markets to outsiders so that they can basically protect their security, but they're also giving away food to all the countries that are in need. So if the United States is able to negotiate a better deal, trade system of how it can, take the food and like transfer it to rest of the world because the US has the capability to do so, then I think the food security aspects can be exacerbated and they can be overcome. But when it comes to Ukraine, I think negotiated settlement would be the only possible way of going forward. Don't know how that's going to happen, but it has to be the only way. Otherwise, it's just total war.
Right, right. And just going last, because as a host, I also am of the mindset that a negotiated settlement is probably necessary at this point. Rohan mentioned credibly that there were suspicions that Russia tried to taint the well, so to speak, of the negotiated or the negotiations previously, peace negotiations. I look at that as it was a very different context. Of course, Ukraine wanted a peace talks to begin during the time because they were on the losing end. Now that they've shown that they can fight, they've pushed themselves outside of the corner, pushed Russia back. They've balanced the scales, so to speak. The only question is how long can they maintain that? Even with modern weaponry, enemy numbers are less of a concern, but they're still a very big concern. Overwhelming tactics are still very doable in today's world. So yeah, I personally do think a peace settlement, even if it's temporary, depending on the agreements, it may give Ukraine time to consolidate their gains. It's all going to come down to territorial divides. I imagine that Russia giving up Ukraine or Russia giving up Crimea would be a non-starter. But at the end of the day, you know, we have a lot more riding than just the sovereignty of Ukraine here. We have millions, possibly billions of lives in the developing world at stake here. We have many developing economies at stake here. They're not just facing a food crisis. They're not just facing energy crisis. They're facing also a large debt crisis that's coming with the ever increasing dollar. The price of the dollar, as that increases, it's going to make it much more difficult for developing nations all over the country, even some developing nations, as we've seen with the developments of the recent UK budget issue and crisis that their PM is causing. That's just the start of it, you know. So while I definitely support Ukraine, there's possibly an even larger cloud looming in the background, a very, very dark cloud. So not to end on that note, but you know, this is conflict, and this one is getting more and more complex by the day. I'm glad that you three, us four, were able to speak on this today. I think we all had something very valuable to add to it, whether that was, you know, local concerns, regional, and then also global, right? So very happy to have you all here today. Thank you for being here.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in free and political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.